Hey everyone, it's Jimmy from Internal here, and today I'm going to show you how to build a customer support tool. So, as you can see in our tool here, we have a table of our customers. You can click on any given customer to see details about, what user settings they have, and also we have a card list that will display any of their Zendesk tickets and information as well. You can use the filter field here to search for a particular customer. And as well, you can update the various settings that they have using this form. So let's take a look at how we built all of this. Okay, let's first start off with a new blank space for our tool. So before we add our first table, which is going to display our users, aka customers, we want to create a function that's going to read this data for the table via HTTP request and allow us to display it. So to do that, we'll go to data over here in our side panel. We'll go to the data source that we want to use. In this case, this is an HTTP data source that we set up earlier, and then we're going to go ahead and create a new function here. So let's call this function list riders, and then let's fill out the endpoint path. In this case, we have /riders, which is going to return data on all of our users /riders. And then let's leave this method here as get. And now we have a couple of URL parameters that are in our API, some of which will allow us to handle pagination, and it's going to enable internal to be able to paginate these results. So we have one URL parameter, which is page, and the other one is called per page. And internal actually has reserved parameters that correspond to these keys that will allow us to enable pagination. So in this case, we have a parameter called page number, which will specify what number page of data results that we want to return, and also page size, which will tell us how big each page is. The other thing we want to do here is let's enable the ability to filter. So in our API, we have a key named first name, which will enable filtering on the first name field. We also have a corresponding filter reserved parameter in internal that will allow us to create filtering. And so there's a little bit of JavaScript in here just to handle some quirks with our API. But what you want to do is use the filter.firstName reserved parameter. So now let's go over to inputs, and let's actually just specify that first name field as our parameter. And you can see there are different types of filter operations that you can have. Just to keep things simple, we'll leave it just as a straight comparison equals. But you can check any additional ones here as long as they're supported by your API. Now, let's go ahead and let's fill in just some values now for our filter. So let's say that the first name is equal to Jim. And let's just, first page of results, 5. And let's just run this preview and see what kind of data is returned. So you can see that the data that we want is returned within result. Let's actually go over to transform here and add a transformer just to pull in the result in a format that we want to work with. So now let's run our function again. And you can see, okay, our data looks good now, and it's in the format that we want to work with. Let's go over to outputs here. Okay. We can hit the update button here to automatically pull in our function outputs. And let's go ahead and change some of these. So email, we actually want to make that a plain text field. Created at, we want to make a date time field, and similar with updated at. And last name should also be a plain text field. Now that everything's set up, let's go ahead and save our function and close out. Now let's add that first table. And we'll go over to our HTTP data source, and we'll select that function that we just created to list riders. Let's change the name of this table to customers. And let's rearrange some of these fields to make it easier for our tool. So let's put first name ahead of last name, and let's also move email right after last name. Let's go ahead and add our next component. This will be a detail component. And here, this is going to display all of the user settings for the customer that is selected. So let's go ahead and choose our demo database, which has a table of user settings. And so in this case, we want to use the auto-generated function to list user settings records. So let's hide some fields that we don't need. We don't need to show the ID here, and we don't need to show created at or updated at. But we do want to show the rest of these settings. And let's move rider ID up. And now for each one of these settings, you can see that they're just true and false. Let's add some pillboxes to make this a little bit nicer looking and to make things clearer for our users. So let's go to our first field here, which is dark mode. Let's select pillbox. And then for the true values, let's say this is on. And for false values, let's say it's off. And then let's actually make this green and red to correspond with on and off. And we can go ahead and quickly do that for all of the other fields. Now let's also add a pop-up form. This is going to allow us to change and edit any user settings that we want. So let's click Add, Components, select Pop-up Form here. We're going to select the same demo database. In this case, we're going to say we want to update our user settings record. For the button, let's just call this Edit Settings. And now let's take a look at the fields. So to get the value for the ID field, we're actually going to have this pre-filled from a component, and we're going to bind this to this detail component and the ID that is being shown within this detail component. Now let's go and take a look at the other fields that we want this to be able to adjust. So for example, let's go take a look at dark mode. Now what we want to do here for the value is let's pre-fill it with the existing value. So let's select pre-fill with a value from a component. And in this case, we're going to choose from this detail view, the data within this detail view, and we're going to choose whatever is already existing for dark mode. And we also want to change this field type to a drop-down. So for the value of true, to turn dark mode on, let's change on to be the actual display name. And instead of false, let's change this to off. So now you can also preview your drop-down here. And so this whole setup will basically say, hey, let's use the existing, whatever the existing value is for dark mode. Let's pre-fill that, whether it's true or false, on or off. And then let's also give the user a drop-down, which will say on or off, but which will also pass the values, true or false, to change the setting. And so we're going to go and repeat that for the other fields that we want to do here, which will be feed beta and cam beta. Now let's go over to the Effects tab. And on Submit, instead of doing nothing, let's actually have this refresh itself. So select the component, User Settings Detail. So now if you turn a setting on or off, you will also see that refresh and be reflected within this detail component. Finally, let's go back out to the detail component and let's move this button. Instead of being the first thing, let's move it to the last item right here. Now let's go ahead and add our final component, which is going to be a card list. Now this card list is going to display all the Zendesk tickets for the selected user that we choose. So let's go and select Zendesk here as our data source, and we want it to list all of the tickets records that we have. Let's change the name of this card list to Zendesk tickets. And now let's add a filter that will enable us to only display the Zendesk tickets that are related to the customer that is selected in the customers table. So we'll go to add a filter. In this case, we're going to select our email as long as our email is equal to a component value. And here we want to choose the customers table, the data in the selected row, and the email. Lastly, we want to go ahead and apply that same filter to our user settings detail so that what is being shown, in this case, we want to match up the rider ID and have that be equal to the component value. And again, we are going to choose our customers table, the data in the selected row, and then the ID, because the ID of a customer will match with the rider ID in the user settings detail. So once we have all of that done, we can simply click Publish and save our tool. And now, as you can see, we've created the tool that was showcased in the beginning. Alright, that's it for now, and I'll see you next time.